I want to thank you all for coming today, and thank our Sega's Espresso Cafe for providing the coffee. We're temporarily out, but I'm going to run upstairs and make some more, and also the Friends of the Fayetteville Public Library who paid for the cookies and other supplies that we needed today. I also just want to mention today we're going to have a talk on planting a landscape, and next month we're going to have a nice follow-up to that with native trees in the urban landscape. The state forester Patty Irwin will lead a slide presentation on planting native trees, what trees are native to this area and that thrive without a lot of extra TLC. And that will be on Friday, October the 22nd from noon to 1 p.m. Today, Carl hardly needs an introduction because I see a lot of familiar faces out here, but Carl Totemeier is a professional horticulturist. He wrote a garden column for the New York Times for 14 years and was the director of Old Westbury Gardens and is a vice president emeritus of the New York Botanical Gardens. He retired and moved to Fayetteville 9 years ago, and he now farms 25 acres and sells perennials and fruits at the farmers market. And he's very generous about sharing his expertise with the people of Fayetteville here in these library presentations and in many other ways. Please join me in welcoming Carl Totemeier.
Whenever anyone mentions that word expert or expertise, I'm reminded of the definition of an expert. An X is an unknown quantity, and a spurt is a drip under pressure. So, anyway. They also used to say in the landscaping business, and I see a few people are involved with it, that it takes only long enough to get expert painted on the side of the pickup truck before you're an expert landscaper. But be that as it may, welcome to Landscape Architecture 101, first session, except you're not going to get any degree out of this. What we are going to do today is just give you an introduction to planning. Why should we, even attempt to do this, or why should you be interested in it? Well, basically, if you do not put some effort into planning for that garden that you're going to either put in yourself or have someone else do for you, it's going to end up being someone else's garden. The landscape designer, the landscape architect who comes in essence, is going to design a garden that's basically then their garden, not yours. And in essence, how can you be certain that you get the things that you want unless you've thought it out ahead of time? So that's one of the reasons for when you come and listen to what I'm going to try to convey to you this morning. The other aspect of it basically is that if you are a do-it-yourselfer, taking this approach, you can end up with a plan that you can follow. It doesn't take, drawing boards and T-squares and a lot of things to do it. It can be done very simply, and that's what we hope to show you. Planning doesn't avoid all problems. One of the more famous women landscape architects in the country was Beatrix Farah. She was the only female in the founding group of the American Society of Landscape Architects. And she had quite a staff, did a lot of work for the Ivy League colleges, people such as the Rockefellers. The most famous work that she has left is Dumbarton Oaks, outside of Washington or in Washington, D.C. Most of the other things have, something has happened through the years that they're really not intact, but that's the one that really is intact. The other one is actually the Rockefeller perennial garden that you see in garden magazines, viewing it through a moon gate, and you see all the perennials in the background. That's on Mount Desert Island in Maine. But she did a lot of that work. She had, as I say, an extensive office staff that drew up tentative plans or proposed plans for these things, but when she came right down to it, she did the actual designing on the site. She would use that plan as a guide, and then when she saw the plans, she would say, yeah, well, this needs to be over there and that here. And the thing that she liked to do was also to come back at least for a number of years after she had done it and see what was happening.
And that's why she liked the job that she had done at Princeton University better than many of the other places. There was an old Scottish gardener there. His first name was Jim. I can't remember his last name. I had known him for a number of years, although he was in his 90s by the time I got to know him. But he was amenable to standing there and looking across the courtyards at Princeton and with her and saying, yeah, you're right, that does need to be moved here or there, and they would do it. And so in other words, a plan is good. It helps you or keep you from making many mistakes, but it isn't the end of the project. In essence, you will need to view it year after year and make little changes accordingly. But without a plan, you tend to end up with what I call the, hey Ma, let's go see what's on sale at the garden center style of landscaping. So the weekend has come, and you know, you start out with your pickup truck or whatever it is, and something's on sale. You take it home, you stick it in, whether it belongs there or not, whether it fits with the other plants, etc. And so that's what we're doing here, is to try to avoid that. The simplest approach still involves the necessity for a plot plan, base plan, whatever you choose to call it. Some of you will have something that you acquired when you purchased your house that will suffice. If you do not, this can be done very easily without the T-square, without the triangles and all the drawing equipment, in essence, simply by using engineering graph paper. If you can't find an engineering supply firm that's available with big enough sheets to work on, in essence, you get a package of 8.5 by 11 graph paper at Collier's or some such place, or one of the office supply places, and you fasten together on the back with Scotch tape till you get a sheet that's big enough. What you want to do is to do this at a scale that is big enough that you can actually work with it. Usually, if you have a small property, that's not a great deal of problem. If you have a big property, you can end up with a big sheet of paper that's too big to handle. So what you can do is do a basic overall drawing showing where the trees are going to go, where the shrub borders are going to go, where the planting beds for flowers are going to go, etc. And then at a smaller scale, like 1 inch equals 20 feet, let's say. And then when you get ready to do a planting bed, let's say the perennial border, then you can reduce this to maybe 1 inch on the drawing is 5 feet. And you just, in other words, do a separate drawing for the perennial border that you've indicated somewhere or another. Okay, how do you go about this, producing this? Well, you get your graph paper, and then, well, here it is in here, and I won't be able to get to it. Okay, tape measure, 2 people. Okay, what if you only have 1 person? Well, it's kind of hard to run the tape measure. The simple way, and I have found it to be sufficiently accurate for landscaping, is you step it off. When I really was involved with this enough, I got to the point where I could do the average property within 6 inches for the average house. Now, many people, this is a pace. The way I learned it, a pace is, in other words, it's 2 steps. And the easiest, or the method using 2 steps, I think, is more accurate because it's a more natural situation and you're less apt to exaggerate your steps. If you start exaggerating, you're not taking normal steps and they won't be uniform. But if you walk naturally, in essence, and then count, every time that second foot goes down, 1, 2, 3, and then you take a measured area, let's say 50 feet, and step it off. How many of those paces does it take you to do 50 feet? And that will tell you then how long your pace is. Mine is 5 feet, if I do it right. So that makes it easy, in other words, to pace it off. And then you simply measure the dimensions of your property. If you don't have a map that already shows this, measure the dimensions of the house, put in all the permanent features, the sidewalks, the driveway. If it is a property where there are already established trees and you plan to leave them, draw anything, in other words, that you see as being permanent, in place.
And you do it by measuring the distances, and then you can move in from the sides of the drawing that you're doing to locate them. So it's really very easy, not complicated at all. And what you want to do then is to outline that very boldly. Get one of those markers, laundry markers, that really leaves a bold line that you can see, because then you can take what we used to call tracing paper, or engineers call it something else, I think, at this point, and you can lay it over the top and begin to sketch in the things or draw in the things that you might like to have in that garden. So let's say one of the things you're interested in is a patio. All right, you don't want a square patio, you want something that has a little bit more of a flowing design to it. And so you draw it on the paper, the tracing paper. It's going to need a little shade, so you put a shade tree there. And you can see it, the original plan, through that tracing paper. Okay, then you put the trees in. And when you press it down, in other words, you can see the original design. And the other thing about that is that, okay, I don't like this one, so tear it off, throw it away, put another one on it. In other words, you don't really attempt to do the final design on that permanent plan until you've got everything the way you want it. And then, in essence, you can draw your final plan on the base plan or plat plan if you so desire. So in other words, it is not complicated to prepare a plan of your property with all of the permanent features. And that approach gives you an opportunity to do trial and error without ending up screwing up your original drawing as such. Okay. Next step, make a want list. Okay, what are you going to want in your backyard? One of the areas where I worked on Long Island, they had 2.5 acre zoning. You know, you couldn't build a house on less than 2.5 acres. And it was interesting, these people very often haven't lived in the city all their life, would come up with lists like this. I mean, you know, in addition to a swimming pool and a rose garden and a perennial garden, etc., they wanted to keep 3 horses back there. Swimming pool, you know, tennis court, the whole thing. Well, you know, it isn't all going to work. But you prepare a list with all the things that you would like to have in that backyard, or, you know, combination of backyard and front yard. It could be all sorts of things. I suspect you can see these, but patio, swimming pool, tennis court, rose garden, vegetable garden, privacy screening. If you want to sunbathe in the backyard, you don't want that old geek across the, you know, the next property staring at you. You need some privacy. Foundation plantings, shade trees, hobby greenhouse, etc., etc. So you put together a list of things that you would like to have, and then comes the practical part of it. You have to sit down and see what will fit. So it's like putting together a jigsaw puzzle. Let's look at shade trees, not from the standpoint of selecting at this point, but from the standpoint of placement. What does a shade tree planting do for your house? How many of you do painting? I don't mean the side of the house, but, you know, paintings, okay. What's probably the last step that you do on a painting to make it look finished? I didn't hear that. Does a painting really look finished until you put the right frame on it? Okay. You really have to frame the picture, and that's one of the first and foremost things that shade trees do, is put a frame on the picture. And what's the focal point of the picture? In this case, the house.
Okay. So you frame it. And the simplest thing, thinking in terms of that simple plan we had there, and okay, any of you that have lived on Long Island, this is a a Levitt house or a little tract house. We don't want to get too complicated here today. But actually, of course, Mr. Levitt required so many shade trees planted in a certain location, etc., and then so many shrubs. That was all specified that had to be done. Okay, in essence, the 2 shade trees in the front of the house provide the framing. In essence, they draw attention to the front door or the front of the house, which is the focal point. We'll get into it more as to how you select them, but they usually then are planted off the corners. Then the minimum or the next step in essence would be to go to the backyard and plant a couple of trees in similar positions off the corners. There are other options, but let's take this simple situation at this point. What else do the trees in the backyard do, or what is their main function? Partly framing, shade, but visually. Stop the eye. It should rise above the height of the house so that they stand above the house at maturity, and stop the eye so that the eye doesn't go off into the sky someplace, but the eye, trees catch the eye, and the eye comes down to the house. Okay, so that's the design purpose of shade trees, and obviously then shade is another factor. In some situations, there is room for street trees, or they're called for. And what this points out to you is that if you have trees along the street, and you have a street on one side and a sidewalk on the other, you have problems. To begin with, of course, if it's a maple tree, what happens? The sidewalk gets heaved. Sometimes even the pavement gets heaved by the roots as they grow. Even with deep-rooted trees, however, the tree will not be able to develop a good root system with all that concrete there. If you look after the typical storm goes through a city, and you will see that the trees that are blown over invariably have a driveway along one side, in most cases the southwest side, because that's generally where the strongest winds come from, or a street that's nearby, or there's a foundation of a building that when the building was erected, it cut through the root system as such. So in other words, they do not have a good root system on the side from which the winds generally come when they're at their maximum. And they will be laying over in the other direction. We had a storm go through our place this summer. Big elm tree out on the corner of the road. It was a good sized one. And immediately it dropped off on the south side of that tree to the road ditch. And of course it just went over, and you saw there were no roots on that side, you see. And in addition to that, in my hosta nursery area, which the hosta is planted along the east side of a row of oaks and hickories, and then a dry creek bed on the other side. And it happened that that dry creek bed, in other words, is on the south and west side of this planting. And some 18 trees landed in the middle of my hostas. They're 50, 60-foot trees. And as they tipped up, and again, in essence, they just hinged over because there weren't any roots on that side. So if you have a situation where you're planting street trees where you can control some of this, in essence, it's better to plant them inside the sidewalk, in other words, toward the house from the sidewalk, than it is to put them between the sidewalk and the street. You are less apt to have problems with the roots on them. Foundation plantings. Are foundation plantings a necessity? What's the purpose of a foundation planting?
foundation.
To hide the foundation. Are most foundations on new houses today, do they need to be hidden? No, they really don't. Foundation planting was invented in the Victorian days when there were these big tall houses that had big front porches, wonderful front porches, but they were raised up off of the ground, and you usually had a stone foundation of some sort under the things that were, that might be 3 feet or so off the ground. In essence, it made that house look like it was standing on stilts. So you needed something not always necessary to hide the foundation, but in essence to tie that house to the ground. Otherwise it looked like it was up there ready to take off. So that's when foundations came about. But with today's houses, where the foundations are not necessarily unattractive, and in most cases where these houses tend to have a low horizontal profile, there really is no reason for the, quote, foundation planting that just runs a row of plants across the front of the house. Another thing that is not necessarily desirable is what, this sort of a uniform planting. How many have you seen where, you have a row of evergreens across the front of the house? Okay, you have a upright one, spreading one, upright one, spreading one, upright one, spreading one. We used to refer to that as the dot dash method of foundation planting. Doesn't make any sense, particularly with today's houses. What does make sense, however, is plantings, again, that help frame the house, that help tie it to the ground so that it doesn't look like it's a sore thumb just sitting there. And this involves plantings at the corners, framing, tying it down, preferably not plantings where you have a pyramidal shrub, juniper, whatever is at the corner. That's accenting the vertical line of the house. What you want is something that's either more horizontal or more mounding that in essence provides a contrast and draws your eye from the fact that you have this sharp corner on the house. The highest points on these plantings across the front of the house here in this so-called foundation planting should be on the corners. And then very often it's desirable to accent or to draw attention to the entrance. In other words, really, if people are coming to the house, that's where they're headed. So you sort of put a little touch of emphasis there. So the secondary height, in other words, would be on either side of the entrance. And a gentleman here, there he is. He was a school superintendent in my wife's hometown, and he knew my father-in-law, and he really was into this foundation planting stuff. And he had big ewes out in front, and he always waited until I came to visit to shear these things. And he liked sort of geometric designs in these things. And he was a contractor, built houses. And one day I made the mistake of telling that, if that's really what he wanted, why didn't he make some forms and pour some green concrete? And, he didn't like that too well. But we didn't have too many other arguments. But this is the sort of thing you want to shoot for in a planting across the front of the house. Tie it to the ground. Soften the vertical lines as such so that it makes it look as if it actually belonged there, rather than with something that dropped out of the sky. If you look at that as it would look on a planting plan, this would be the alternative. This is the old method of just planting a row plants across the house. And this would be the sort of thing that would be much more attractive, using flowing lines, drawing attention to the focal point of the house, and then softening it. If you are planting a grouping at the corner, again, the one to the rear would be the tallest one, and then with a grouping of shorter shrubs in front. This can be accompanied by ground covers, and we'll talk about ground covers in a minute. In some cases, people like to put flowering plants there, perennials or annuals, etc. I think, well, I was involved. Well, I wasn't involved. I sold some plants. But I wasn't involved in planting. But this person here, out of town a ways, with a new house, Everything she planted across the front of the house, in essence, was herbaceous perennials that were going to die back to the ground in the fall, which in essence, you see, left that entire winter with really nothing there in the front of the house. So you want to think in terms of making this something that is attractive 12 months of the year, so you want evergreens there. But do you want solely evergreens? It's a much more interesting planting if you blend evergreen and deciduous, because you can get different textures, different colors of foliage in the fall. Some of them will flower in the spring, etc. So in essence, you want evergreens in that front planting because you want it 12 months out of the year, but you want to add some variety by using some deciduous plants as well. Okay. Balance. Those of you who paint will understand this, or who do any kind of artistic work, that you want the picture, in effect, to have balance to it. All right, so you have a split level house that's taller on one side. Do you put the tall shade tree on that corner? Or do you do as we have down here, you put the tall one on the other corner, and the shorter, perhaps a flowering tree like a flowering dogwood on the corner of the house that's the highest? Which gives you the best balance? Okay, in this case, the taller tree balances by putting it on this side, the taller side of the house. And you will find that, in other words, it's just more attractive to do it that way. And basically, I'll just hold this one up. Basically, it's like a teeter-totter, a fulcrum in there. In essence, if you get too much weight on one side, it makes it almost look as if the landscape were tilting in that direction. So you do want balance, as you see here. Tear some of those off. Okay, let's look at the backyard. Here is a possible way to lay out a typical small property backyard in the middle of the city. In essence, you have framed the backyard by using 4 trees, one on each corner, which is one approach to doing it. You have left the center open so that you have room for activities. If you get kids, in other words, they need a place to throw the ball, or just put up a badminton net or whatever it is they do for entertainment these days. Confining the plantings to the perimeter. This is sort of, the opposite of the used tractor tire in the front yard in the middle of the yard with the petunias hanging over the edge of it. But in essence, you see what it does is to enclose the area. This could be a screening hedge of some sort to give you the privacy we're talking about. Along the edge with the hedge or the fence or whatever it is that you use to delineate the property line, in essence, that can also form the background for shrub border, for perennial border, etc. So that a lot of these things can do double duty. So here's one that's very symmetrical. Trees on each corner. One of the things, and I'll show it to you in this one, and I probably can just hold this up.
It's like Vanna White.
Here's an option. To begin with, you want something that's, a focal point, something that's a little interesting in that backyard, not just trees and flowers or shrubs or whatever it happens to be. You want a little gazebo that you can sit in at night. Screens on it, of course, so the mosquitoes don't get you. And maybe you have your patio here, and you get a line, a vista across there. Okay, that displaces this tree, so you have lost your balance, in fact. Well, one of the things you can keep in mind is that you can plant a grouping of 3 smaller plants, or whatever the number happens to be, that will give you as much mass as one big plant. And in doing so, in essence, you have achieved balance here as well. So there's more than one way to do it. And this might be,
it might even be a rose planting that you put back in that corner. So it could be almost anything that you wanted that you located in this corner. But the point being that you still need balance, but it can be done in this way by substituting a clump of small flowering trees for the big one that would normally have been on that side. Balance, important. This one I think I'll just hold up because I'm not going to leave it very long. Whatever approach you take, it is important to have that open space in a small property. There has been a movement in England in recent years led by a nurseryman there, Alan Bloom, who's introduced a lot of perennials into the trade in not only Europe but in this country, to use what he calls island beds. And that, in essence, you see, puts plantings out in the middle of these green spaces. Well, this is fine on his property because I don't know how many acres he's got there, but it's the nursery is off to one side, and then he's got this private area with all these flower beds and so forth, and then it's a big area. He even has, he's a train enthusiast, and he's got old trains and model trains and stuff that he's built that run in through the garden. So, I mean, he's got space to put flower beds here and still have all kinds of space left. But if you've got a small backyard, especially if you've got kids, in essence, you need to keep that open space. So as we said before, you confine your plantings to the perimeter as such. Now, one other point, well, I've got this up here. In most cases, you will find that having curved lines is more pleasing to the eye than straight lines. Straight lines say formality. Formality says if there's something down the line there someplace that's got to branch out a line, it troubles you. You have to get the pruning shears out and go get it. But if you have a flowing line where your planting is a little more naturalistic, it really doesn't make a darn bit of difference if one of them's got a branch that sticks out a little too far down there, because it looks like it's supposed to be that way. Keep in mind, the more formal you get in any of these plantings, the more maintenance you have, because you just can't stand to see things out of line. One other thing, by the way, about naturalistic plantings is that it just feels more comfortable to pull that lawn chair out and sit out there in the evening and enjoy it than it does if you've got something that's extremely formal. It just lends itself to that much more. So this is what you don't want to do, is fill all your space up with planting beds. I've got the perfect transparency for overhead projector, and yeah, there's one over there, except that most places don't have overhead projectors any longer, so that, you know, I've lost all that sort of thing. But it shows what can happen when you allow this to happen. And in that overhead transparency, you know, like there's a big wood pile here. I think there was even an outhouse over in the corner. And somewhere in here is a vegetable garden. And to get from one thing to the other, you've got to go like this, because you know, to get around them. So in essence, that's why you leave open space. Now the other, I guess I mentioned, I forget whether I did now or not, but I intended to mention when I had the other one up. When you make these curves in any bed along the edge of the property, there's one thing to keep in mind, particularly if you have a riding lawnmower. Can you make that corner without having to back up and pull up and back up and pull up to get around there? The problem particularly for some of you ladies will be that your husband
decides he's not going to go to that trouble anymore. He's going to take a shortcut. He's going to change that curve. So lay it out to begin with. with the credit you can make with that lawnmower. Otherwise, trouble.
One of the complaints that I get, by the way, from women is that their husbands seem addicted to weed eaters. And we've almost come to the conclusion that it's a testosterone thing. Somehow or another. One of the things that we haven't talked about in this landscape, we've talked about in others placing shrubs. You can use shrubs at the corners of the house and on either side of the entrance. You can use shrubs as a border around the backyard. And back there, they can either stand as a shrub border or they can be the hedge, the screen between you and the neighbors, and they can at the same time then be the background for flowers that you plant in front of them, etc. So many uses. If you have, like at the corner of the house, your shrub planting, the house is over here, and this is the lawn. It is sort of a precipitous thing. In other words, the eye goes along like this on the lawn, and suddenly up it goes. Okay, so one of the things that ground covers do, in addition to, number one, help to keep down weeds. Number two, in many cases, helping to retain moisture. In some cases, the ground cover itself maybe flowers quite well. In other cases, you can plant spring bulbs in the ground cover, let them come up through. The bulb foliage then will just die down and disappear in the ground cover. So there are many things ground covers do. But the other thing is that they provide a transition from this long, low horizontal line of the lawn to this higher jump that you take to shrubs. So ground covers can provide a transition as far as the way the eye flows in looking at a landscape. You should ask yourself some things about the plants in selecting the plants. After a couple of summers like we have had, I think it's really beginning to get critical that people spend some time in actually selecting their plants according to what is going to be low maintenance, that isn't going to die out on you because it gets hot and so forth. City of Denver is one of the leaders in this, and because that's an area where they have water problems. Water is very much in short supply as it is in the Southwest, etc. And of course many people moved to Arizona and they tried to take their eastern or midwestern lawn with them as such. Now in many cases they have rules against it. But Denver has been one of the leaders in coming up with this. In fact, there's several books that they put out. A book on xeriscape, in other words, planting plants that require or have minimum water requirements. And there's a whole group of plants in here that fit that particular category. I, in recent years, have experimented a little bit with some of the new plants that have been introduced. And one of the things that about plants introduced recently in this country, so many of them have been coming from the Pacific Northwest or England. How does our climate resemble either England or the Pacific Northwest? Things can do pretty well 9 months out of the year, when you bring them from there, but the 9 months are the fall, winter, and spring rather than the summer. So I really think we need to be paying more attention to where plants have originated and whether or not they're adapted to our hot, dry summer area, rather than having to spend all your time making sure that the sprinklers are running or that you have the hose in your hand. My hands, after this summer, just naturally, if I stand still, they go into that position because I've been holding a darn hose all summer long. So I think that we need to think in terms not only of hardiness as it relates to winter hardiness, but also how they do in the summer. Interestingly enough, Mark Cathy, Dr. Mark Cathy, some of you may remember back in the days when, what's her name? Can't think of it now. Was on the Today Show. The woman that has...
Jane Collins?
No. Barbara Walters. When Barbara Walters on the Today Show, Mark Cathy used to come in pulling a little red wagon with plants, and then he'd talk about those plants. Mark was the head of ornamentals research at the USDA in Huntsville for many years. He then went on to be the director of the National Arboretum in Washington, also under the USDA. And he was the president of the American Horticulture Society for quite a number of years as such. And he has developed his heat zone map. Now, the only thing about it is that it really hasn't been refined down to the point where you can really trust that a given plant is going to do well in the zone. Now, for example, he lists campanulas as being plants that do well in this zone here. A few of them do. Most of them don't. It just gets too hot and they cook out in the middle of the summer. So in other words, it needs to be refined. But when that is refined, in essence, you will not only have a hardiness map or zone based on the average winter temperatures, but you will also have one based on summer conditions as well. And that will be very much desirable when it happens. Soil preference. If you know that the plant has a particular soil preference, okay, azaleas in this area. And your soil is not very acid. Are you going to want to really spend your life keeping that soil acid the rest of your life and planting azaleas all over the place? They're lovely. I love them. But it's much easier, in other words, to plant something that is adapted to that soil pH you already have. So you have to think, in other words, do I really want to go to the effort of modifying that soil, applying mulches that are going to be acidic in the reaction, maybe even fertilizing with acid fertilizer as such to keep those that soil so that it will support the azaleas. Interestingly enough, in many areas on Long Island, where I spent about 20-some years, the soil was actually so acid, down to about 4.5, that rhododendrons and azaleas benefited from an application of lime. Yeah, we tried it at Planting Fields Arboretum, and boy, did they perk up when they got a little lime. Keep in mind that Long Island is a sandbar, basically. It's the terminal ring of the Wisconsin Glacier, and it's almost all sand. Drainage. If you've got a plant that can't stand wet feet, and you've got a heavy clay soil that doesn't have good surface drainage, maybe even be a little cupped to the point where it holds water, in other words, does that make sense to plant a plant that has to have good drainage there? There are ways of handling this. You can modify the drainage by putting a French drainage system underneath it, by grading it so that you get surface runoff, by using raised beds that raises the planting above the ground level, in effect, so that water doesn't affect it. Another approach literally would be to select plants that like that moist situation to begin with, and there are plenty of them out there. Exposure. Does the plant like sun? Does it like shade? One of the things I've discovered since moving here is that a lot of the plants that the book says are sun plants will actually benefit from shade. They really will do better if they get 3-4 hours up to a half a day of shade. And the best time for a plant to get sun is when? Morning. I've got you trained. Best time is in the morning. The sun, the heat comes, in other words, along about 3-4 o'clock in the afternoon. And that's the time when it's really hard on them. The other thing is that there are those of us, or among us, who in essence like to live dangerously, I guess. and we really do end up selecting plants that aren't really reliably hardy here. We're going to try them. It's a challenge. We're going to see if we can't grow them. Okay. Where do you plant that possibly tender plant that you just can't live without? You saw it in somebody's mail order catalog. You got to try it. You know it really is not absolutely hardy. Where are you going to put it?
Hot.
That's a cop-out. If it's a tropical, obviously, you put it in a pot and you take it in the winter. But in essence, what exposure, as far as the house is concerned, for example, is the most desirable one for a plant that's not reliably winter hardy? East, south, south, south. I hear southeast.
North.
She's going to freeze it, put it on the north, and whoever else said south is going to put it where the sun thaws it out in the daytime and it freezes at night. I like that southeast. Okay, you see, the southeast It's going to maybe get some morning sun in the winter, but it's not going to get sun in the heat of the day. The temperature is going to be a little more stable there. It's to be protected by the house, or maybe this can be on that side of a shrub planting, for example. But being on that side, it's protected from the cold winds and from the cold temperatures to some degree as such. So in other words, the most stable area to plant something that's tender tends to be on the southeast of whatever the building is or whatever the protective group of plants happens to be. In addition to that, Los Angeles State County Arboretum is a good example. It's foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains out there, part of what was Lucky Baldwin's old ranch. Santa Anita Racetrack is just across the street from it. And, you know, that's most of what you see there are subtropical, Mediterranean climate. And yet, there is one spot where you will find the same trees and shrubs growing that you would find in my home state of Iowa. Where is that spot? Well, keep in mind that the mountains are above it. Foothills of the San Gabriels. Mount Wilson is, if you're on a clear day, if you can find a clear day, when it's no smaller, you can see Mount Wilson Observatory up there. So the air drains down the mountain, and there's one spot in that place that's low. Where does the cold air collect? I just lost. Where does the cold air collect? The lowest spot. So they can grow trees there that in essence would not be able to grow otherwise. They put them in a cold spot. Okay, so microclimates. That's what we're talking about. The hardiness zone map for the Los Angeles area alone has, I think, 13 separate zones and subzones in it.
Just Los Angeles, because of just the altitude and the distance from the ocean.
As such. Okay, size and growth rate. Do you put a tree that's going to be 40 feet across when it gets big in a space that's 10 feet wide? Lots of people do. Do you have a, you know, do you have a picture window on the front of the house, and do you put a Magnolia Solangiana that's going to be 30 feet tall in front of the picture window? My father-in-law did. So you need to know not as much the size of the plant when you buy it, because that little thing very often is going to get big, but you need to know how big that plant is going to get when it's mature, and to account for that.
So as you do that plan that we showed you a while ago, if you are putting in an oak tree that's going to be 40 feet tall, do you draw it in that plan as a little circle that's 5 feet around, you know, based on your scale?
I'm going to consult with the utilities first.
Well, that's another point, and don't let me forget, and I'll mention it in a minute. But in essence, this tends to happen, in other words. When I first moved to Long Island, the Levitt houses had been in existence long enough that people were coming in and saying, what do I do? What's the matter? You know, I used to plant marigolds around that little tree in the front yard, and they don't grow there anymore. Well, that little tree was 40 feet across, and it made too much shade for marigolds. Okay, so in other words, you need to be realistic as you draw a plan, whether it's for you or whether it is, the other alternative, by the way, in drawing this plan is to have it prepared, as we said, so that when you consult with the landscape people, in essence, they know what you want, and it can, in essence, be your garden. So in essence, you need to draw these things into scale, not as small plants, but as mature plants. And as far as utilities are concerned, many utility companies around the country, and this hasn't happened in this area, actually have taken the lead in this thing, and they have produced very lovely color brochures as such, with, like the Denver water thing that we had here a minute ago, listing the trees that are well adapted for use under power lines. And in some cases, they will even do promotional things in the spring, or planting season, in essence, to promote the right kind of trees. So, okay, those are all things that you need to think in terms of. Characteristics, flowers, fruits, fall color, winter interest. you need all of these things in the landscape if you have 12-month interest in the garden, or you know, or something that's interesting to walk out and look at even in the middle of the winter. You want to think about some things, such as fruits, however. Do you want to plant an apple tree in your backyard? Are you going to spray it? What are you going to do with all those rotten apples that fall on the ground? Probably better to plant a flowering crab apple and buy your apples at the farmer's market. I think those are some of the things you really need to think of. Very often, in other words, fruit trees, unless they're well taken care of, really just become a mess, because you're going to drop fruit that, in essence, may be too wormy or you know, cull stuff. You're not going to use it as such, and it's just an extra chore to clean it up. On the other hand, if you, again thinking in terms of fruits, how many of you have hollies in your yard? How many of you have good berry crop on them every year? How many of you have a male holly sticking around there someplace? With holly, it takes two to tango. So you better account for there being a male holly in the reasonably close proximity. They don't have to be hugging close, but as long as the bee can find them, they're all right. So those are things you think about. Where do you find that information? Yeah, books will give you that information. Where else can you get that information? Cooperative Extension. They have always been leaders in that sort of thing. And you will find in many cases that there will be brochures on all the things that we cover, all the things we talked about here, so that you can get that information there. I'm just going to hold this one up quickly. Maintenance requirements. Do you want a high maintenance garden? If you want to minimize maintenance, you need to think in terms of, is this a plant that's going to have to be pruned all the time or sheared all the time to look attractive? If you want low maintenance, that's no good. If you have a choice between a shrub or a perennial or whatever it happens to be that is subject to diseases and pests, are you going to take that one or the other which is not subject to diseases and pests? Is it subject to storm damage? If you want a quick growing tree, you can plant a silver maple. But when the silver maple gets a little size to it, what happens to it? Okay. What about Bradford pears? Bradford pears, when they first came out, were promoted as being sort of a substitute for Lombardy poplar, growing straight up in the air. However, they hadn't had them around long enough to find out that they grow horizontal and they get real big to begin with, so that they fill space differently than people intended. The other thing is that all the branches come off essentially in the same place. This leads to weak crotches, and when they get to maturity, in essence, the first windstorm, the first ice storm comes, and all these branches break down. And all over Springdale, Fayetteville, after an ice storm, you will go around and see them cutting them off. And yet, what do you find in the nurseries? Bradford pear. Aristocrat is a better choice. It'll do the same job, but will not have that same problem as far as branching. What is its water requirements? What's its fertilizer requirements? Those are all things you need to consider. Quickly, you have an old landscape planting, an existing. Maybe this is an old house, and these plants around the foundation, particularly around the house, have become overgrown. You drive up to the thing, you can hardly see the house for the shrubs, and I've seen many of these around the country. Okay, we had one when I was the director of Baird Cutting Arboretum on the South Shore of Long Island, a former estate. It had an annex that the daughter had built and lived in. She had a pipe organ there, and that was where Albert Schweitzer came when he came back to this country to give recitals to raise money for his mission in Africa. That's where he rehearsed, in her pipe organ. And there were beautiful stained glass windows in this, but you couldn't see them from the outside because there was a great big giant U outside that big stained glass window. And you didn't even know the window was there unless you got in and could look out and see a little light coming through the U. We looked at it. I couldn't get my guys to do anything about it, so I brought my own chainsaw in one weekend and did it when nobody else was around. But in essence, see, there's this great big U, probably 15 feet across at least, solid branches coming out horizontally and all this. But if you looked under there, you saw this sort of lovely vase shape of trunks coming up from the ground. Okay, so you cut off these branches until you got up about so far, and then you had this lovely vase-shaped tree with a top up here, but branches that you could see through and see the stained glass window. In many cases, you can take an old shrub that's overgrown and make a very lovely, attractive, small tree out of it. And the nice thing about this one is that whenever it was wet, that trunk became purple. That wet bark was purple. Another quickie, scale. If you have a ranch house, 1 story, horizontal, was the elm tree the best choice? It tends to be removed as a choice at this point, but the elm tree, how tall will the elm tree get? Well, under right conditions, an elm tree could reach 120 feet. So do you plant an elm tree over the top of a ranch house that maybe to the peak of the roof is no more than 25 feet? The answer is no. In other words, we need to be paying more attention to planting trees that are in scale not only with the building itself, but also the size of the property. So in other words, many of our city properties need trees that will get to be a maximum of about 30 or 40 feet tall rather than 60, 70, 80, 90, or 100 feet tall. So we need to be aware of that. And in many cases, you will tend to find that really what we call flowering trees are probably adequate as far as the height that you need in the particular plants. Okay, this is the one on spacing. Just to remind you again that you don't draw in your plan a 40-foot wide tree it's a little circle like this that may, on the scale, indicate 5 or 10 feet, but you draw it into the scale it's going to be when it matures. This one we've already mentioned, sun versus shade. In other words, you should know what your situation is, and you select your plants according to which of those conditions prevails. The low maintenance one. I ought to do one on low maintenance sometime. But anyway, some of the techniques for low maintenance, the use of a mulch, the use of a ground cover. One of the interesting things that you can do so that you don't have to trim along the edge of a bed is to put in a mowing strip. Let's say you've got one brick or one of these concrete pavers laying flat, and then one on its edge, and then that's where you run the lawnmower wheel. And then you don't have to come along and trim these beds to make that edge, even. And this you can cope with. You can't very often the metal edgings or the plastic edgings because they don't provide the surface for the wheel, in other words, to travel on. And we mentioned pruning. This is where I had my argument with my father-in-law. We really got along very well. But in any case, I had my argument with him because he wanted to make everything look as if it was a green gumdrop or a barrel or an inverted ice cream cone in green. Most plants really are much more attractive if they're pruned. The exception is hedges, where you want a clipped hedge for its effect, but most are best if they're pruned in a naturalistic manner, so that instead of shearing with shears, you use hand clippers, and you can cut them back just as far, but the final result, or the end result, will be a plant that will look as natural. In some cases, if you really get good at it, you really have to look to see where you pruned. It takes a little more snipping, but in essence, you can keep that natural appearance. So pruning is an art, really. And the other aspect of pruning, and with that we'll be ready to wind up, is that which is the healthy approach to pruning for a typical shrub? Shearing or pruning back to side branches, making individual cuts, keeping that naturalistic appearance?
Selective pruning, or what you described as.
Yeah. Why? When you shear a shrub or even a tree, in essence, you create density. And what you do is to shut the light out from the inside of the plant. You get a fringe of growth around the outside edge. So in essence, everything dies out on the interior. That also makes an ideal location in many cases for disease organisms, for insects. A healthier plant is the open one through which light can pour, through which breezes can blow, etc. What is the healthy way to prune a tree? Where you lop all these branches off and, create that giant hat rack up against the sky? Or is it selective pruning, cutting small branches from the interior part of the tree out, opening it up? If you have to head back a branch, you cut back to a side branch rather than stubbing it off. Okay, the latter is, again, the healthy approach. It opens it up. It allows light to get in. And what kind of growth do you get when you lop a top of a tree off? You get vigorous, upright growth. Everything tries to compete with each other as if it was the terminal bud. And it tends to all grow up real bushy as such. And in essence, the attachment of those new branches that come from adventitious buds onto the branches of that tree are not sound, not firm, not good attachments. They're weak. And the people who cut these trees back, making hat racks out of them because they're afraid of storms, have something that the storm then is really going to blow apart. It makes more sense in pruning a big tree for storm protection to go up in and thin it so that the wind blows through it, rather than creating something that is so dense that it stops the wind and is going to have problems with it. Okay, so with these things in mind, you now can go home and plan your garden. In essence, what I hope we've provided you with are some of the tools that lead you to think a little bit, in other words, about how you go about this sort of a thing and what the important things are. Now, I don't know whether Kendall would be interested or not, but I would be interested over a period of time between now and spring or whenever of doing the follow-up to this and spending one session on trees, one on shrubs, and one on flowers. To, in essence, fill in what we started here. So if we can schedule those and you're interested, why we might take that approach. Any questions? All you people have to get back to work. Boy, you're late now.
Like all these retirees, they don't have to get back to work. Why?
Why don't the trees root under the sidewalk and under the driveway?
The answer is probably varied, keeping in mind that something like 75–80% of a tree's roots naturally are in the upper foot of soil. So that forces them to go deeper. And the biggest problem probably then is lack of aeration.